Hello everyone, Dr. Sparkle here, and welcome to a very spooktacular special Halloween episode of Chrontendo. And this episode is very, very late, and once again, I'm sorry. Yeah, I know. So here we are grinding our way through the incredibly hectic December 1989 release schedule, where frickin' 10 games are coming out like every single week. Though once we hit Christmas, then we'll be back to around 2 games per week for a while. And by 1990, of course, we'll have hit, peak Famicom, then the number of games will actually start decreasing. Until then, though, we've got a lot of games right now, 15 Japanese games released between December 1st and December 15th. The highlight of this episode is almost certainly going to be a rather unusual title from Capcom, but we also have an RPG, a baseball game, a shoot-'em-up, a puzzle game mostly known in the US for its Game Boy version, and a few pretty oddball titles. So let's begin at December 1st, 1989. We are still stuck on December 1st, 1989. Well, actually, there's only one more game before moving on to December 8th. So if you guys liked Vegas Connection last episode, then you'll love this one from the same developer, Graphic Research. Meimon Takonishi Ouendan is a game that is sort of in the form of a military strategy game, though rather than armies or whatever, we have Ouendan, those cheerleading squads that chant and pound on drums during games. We are familiar with them, of course, from the soundtrack of every single Famicom baseball game we've seen so far. Also, the original Japanese version of Elite Beat Agents was based around Ouendan. So boy, how do we explain this one? So, your male cheerleader squad is engaged in a street war of some sort with cheer squads from other schools, I guess. I don't know if this is a real thing in Japan, but you've got to conquer the city block by block. You have 6 guys and face innumerable enemies, all of whom are individually weaker than you by quite a bit. Each side takes turns moving. When 2 opposing units occupy the same square, a battle begins. You can punch or kick, those are the first 2 options here, and less useful, at least at first, are the defense moves, the ones below that where you can attempt to block an attack. Now the weird thing is this, do you see that fist coming at you? As it gets closer, it appears to increase the odds of the enemy's attack being successful, so you have to pick an option really quickly. The main dude, Tachibana, is far and away the toughest, and can dispatch just about anybody with ease. Not surprisingly, this is based on a manga, one by Juzo Tokoro. It ran from 1984 to 1992, and seems to be virtually unknown in the West. It did, however, get a live-action film adaptation in 1987. The movie looks utterly ridiculous, and the title is known in English as West Taco Cheerleaders. Every level has a boss of sorts. In level 1, he's hiding up in the corner. Once you've cleared him out, you can move on to the next level. You get experience for winning fights, and you can level up, increasing your health and attack and so on. Now this game does throw in a few more twists and turns. Some levels have shortcuts using manholes, though you must jump over these barrel things rolling along the ground. Characters will sometimes have an option for a special attack to appear in the menu. This does much heavier damage. Your characters can learn special moves as the game progresses. Also, enemies sometimes attack you with weapons, such as bamboo swords here. You can take these weapons from defeated enemies, and once you have them, you can do just huge amounts of damage. Honestly, these street fights start looking more and more like straight-up murder at this point. Meimon Takonishi Ouendan looks pretty decent, though in comparison to the other strategy games we've seen like last time, Conflict and Mirai Senshi Leos, it's very, very simple, and obviously highly repetitive. Still, you might actually enjoy this if you give it a try. We're in the middle of the holiday season, so tons of games will be coming out every single week during the month of December. We have a bunch of titles released on December 8th, but let's start with Osomatsu-Kun, Back to Zami no Deppa, published by Bandai and developed by Tosei. Now, Tosei had developed tons of quickie games for Bandai, going all the way back to crap like Chubby Cherub. As we've seen though, by the end of '89, their stuff is actually not bad, quality-wise. Presumably bigger budgets, more development time, and so on have gradually resulted in Bandai games looking pretty good. I think it really helps to have pre-established character design and art style, as we have here. Tosei is able to reproduce good 8-bit depictions of manga characters. Back to Zami no Deppa is a menu-based adventure game with maybe a slightly RPG-ish feel to it. There are top-down villages and whatnot, you have money, health, and can sleep at inns, but it's mostly interacting with characters and environments via menus. As you might recall, Osomatsu-Kun was a very long-running manga comic. It started back in the 60s and got various animated adaptations, games, and so on. This is actually the second Osomatsu-Kun game we've seen. The first one, Osomatsu-Kun Hachamecha Gekitou, was the fourth game for the still quite new Mega Drive. It was actually the first Sega Mega Drive game that wasn't an arcade port. It was released about a year before this one, in December 1988, and we covered it in Chrontendo Episode 8. The story of the comic is officially about a young boy named Osomatsu, who is one of 6 sextuplets. There's a pretty big cast of characters, however, and Yami, the goofy dude we see here, in particular plays a really big part in the comics, the animated cartoon shows, and this game. The subtitle is a pun on Back to the Future, and this has a time-traveling storyline. You start in Osomatsu's hometown, and then you interact with various characters. There's icons for leave, talk, show, examine, and the light bulb means to think, which is a rather unusual option for these sorts of games. Eventually, you will enter this time machine and travel throughout time. First to Edo-era Japan, and later to prehistoric times. Undoubtedly, there's a lot of wacky humor here, but obviously it's lost on non-Japanese speakers. Perhaps someday a translation for this will appear, and until then it's difficult to really gauge just how good of a game this actually is. As you know, here at Chrontendo headquarters, there's nothing we like to see more than the names Micronix and Toei on a game. And to make things even better, this is a Japan-only RPG which, quite frankly, looks more like something out of 1986 than 1989. Shin Satomi Hakkenden is the name, and the cultured among you will recognize this as a reference to the famous 19th century novel, Nanzo Satomi Hakkenden, sometimes called 8 Dog Chronicles in English, and which itself was inspired by the classic Chinese novel, The Water Margin. This plot involves 8 samurai brothers who have various samurai-type adventures. In the game, you actually get to choose which of the 8 characters you want to start the game with. Shin Satomi Hakkenden has some clever and fresh ideas, but it is wrapped up in a rather dull and unpolished RPG. Now, the gimmick of the 8 different characters works like this. Just like most RPGs, different characters have different strengths and weaknesses. But aside from this, each character starts in a different town. You then need to go out into the world and find the other characters and get them to join your party. Now so far this falls pretty neatly into the Dragon Quest II style formula. Square's Tom Sawyer from last episode was another example of this very common JRPG formula. But Shin Satomi Hakkenden mixes up the formula a bit by making the game, in theory, replayable, as it'll feel like a different game depending on which character you start with. Though once you've recruited all of their 7 members, then at that point the game becomes the same no matter who you started with. Now, this is actually not the first game we've seen based on this novel. The rather similarly titled Sakomi Hakkenden was released by SNK in January 1989. And there was a game in which the samurai were replaced by singing idols called Idol Hakkenden, if you can believe that. Natsumi put out that one, and there was an RPG on the PC Engine called Makai Hakkenden Shada. So yes, this is the 4th Satomi Hakkenden game of 1989, and probably the last. But the crazy thing is, this apparently isn't even a direct adaptation of the novel, but rather it's an adaptation of a movie based on the novel, based on Nanzo Satomi Hakkenden. The title screen shows a credit to Toshio Kamada and Haruki Katakawa films, which leads us to the 1983 movie known as Legend of the Eight Samurai in English, starring Sonny Chiba. This film was produced by Haruki Katakawa Films and distributed by Toei, and the screenplay was written by Toshio Kamada, who based it on his 1983 novel titled Shin Satomi Hakkenden, or New Satomi Hakkenden. One piece of trivia, the movie was directed by Kenji Fukasaku, one of Japan's great directors of action movies, known for his 70s Yakuza movies, also Message from Space, the 1978 Star Wars ripoff, and many others. Even the folks not really familiar with Japanese movies of the 60s and 70s might know him from Battle Royale, the last film he completed before he died. And video game fans might recall his involvement in the PlayStation 2 game Clock Tower 3. But despite this, there's no obvious connection between the game and the movie. The game box art uses a pretty generic looking piece of artwork on the front, though on the back the illustrations of the characters do match their appearance in the movie. And the game itself feels like a pretty generic RPG for most part, though as mentioned it's pretty unpolished and ugly looking. It has a fondness for maze-like world design. There's usually only one narrow path through a village. You can't just walk around freely, since obstructions like trees, fences, and buildings block you from venturing outside the designated path. This leads to problems with NPCs even being more obnoxious when they get in your way, since the village paths are usually only 1 tile wide. There's literally no way of reaching the other side of this village until this guy decides to move. The overworld is also filled with these little valleys that wind their way through mountains and such. Some parts do open up a bit more, but the game mostly forces you to take very specific routes from one town to the other. You can only save in castles, so one of the first things you'll need to do is find one before you get killed by monsters, and thus forced to restart the game. Combat is unbalanced. You can take 3 steps outside the village and get instantly killed by a wandering monster in 1 hit. Also, the battles have music but no sound effects, which feels very odd. More technically accomplished games like Dragon Quest use visual cues, like a slight screen shake when you get hit. By comparison, Shin Satomi Hakkenden with its totally static screens and no sound effects feels pretty lifeless. Now there's a variety of technical issues with this game. Apparently later in the game, when you have all 8 party members, it stops updating your character's hit points when they get hit during battles, until the turn is over and then everyone's hit points update all at once. When there are multiple enemies, you can't select which ones to attack. Instead, your party members attack randomly, which greatly diminishes the tactical aspect of the battles. Overall, a game that looks interesting in theory, but perhaps it would have been better off with a more technically capable developer than Micronix. Hudson Soft is in sort of a strange position here, both publishing games for the Famicom, while at the same time being the primary publisher for a competing console which they had even helped design the PC engine. Seirei Gari was published by Hudson Soft, but the development work was farmed out to Advanced Communications, sort of a low-end developer responsible most famously for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and a number of mostly forgotten oddball titles like Circus Caper. The title screen is annoying. When it appears, you have around 2 seconds to press start, otherwise it loads up the intro cutscene. As you might suspect from the screen layout here, this is approximately the 1 millionth menu-based adventure game released for the Famicom. For the purpose of this video, we'll check out this unofficial translation, which titles the game Ghost Hunter. So our heroes are eating breakfast or something when this Rosenkreuz just sort of appears out of nowhere and announces his evil intentions, as video game villains often do. Of course, he then kills the kindly grandpa and steals the hero's girlfriend. It's interesting, this game suffers from some rather ugly artwork and none too exciting environments and puzzles, but has some fantastic music. So after being knocked out by Rosenkreuz, you wake up in a hospital where one of the doctors just happens to be some sort of expert on mysterious phenomena and whatnot. So you hightail it to what I believe is Rosenkreuz's house to check for clues. You have the standard menu of options, maybe a bit simplified compared to the Osomatsu-Kun game. There's check, speak, take, use, and go. For the most part, you check a new screen when you enter it. This will open up some new things to check, and sometimes you will find an object to take or use. For example, in Rosenkreuz's house, you enter a room, find a key, use it to unlock another room, find another key, and then enter another room where you find a letter which leads you to the next location. Now, the note leads our heroes in the direction of Shambhala, which is going to be tricky to get to because it's a legendary city mentioned in old Taoist and Buddhist writings. Seirei Gari combines all sorts of esoteric ideas, both Eastern and Western. The name of the villain, Christian Rosenkreuz, refers to the supposed founder of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. The history of Rosicrucianism is quite odd, but I'll simply say that in the 17th century Germany, some anonymous pamphlets caused quite a stir in Europe due to the wild ideas they contained. The author claimed to be a member of some secret society that existed for hundreds of years and was founded by one Christian Rosenkreuz. While it's generally believed that the pamphlet's author just made up Rosenkreuz and the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, there are groups today that still call themselves Rosicrucians. There are various other references to esoteric figures such as King Solomon. And here, in the village of Asuke, we find various mysterious rock structures which lead to Shambhala somehow. The goal in this village is to find the hidden entrance to the tunnels under the rock, and this puzzle is solved by visiting bird stores, bars, temples, speaking to the curator of the local museum, and of course picking up various objects and using them in unintuitive ways. By the way, Asuke is a real place. It's a village in Nara, which was the capital of Japan in the 7th century. There are a number of important old temples there, and the stone structures like this one, Turtle Rock, are absolutely real. I hesitate to call Seirei Gari a bad game. It's an intriguing subject for a game, some parts are kind of cool, but overall it's just not very well developed, and its construction is pretty damn generic, even for a Japanese adventure game. Well, here's another fine example of a game with great music, but the game itself isn't really that hot. Taito Chase H.Q. was for some reason never released outside of Japan, despite being based on a popular arcade hit from 1988. Almost everything about this is just so ugly. The developer is credited as Disco, a name that pops up on various Taito Famicom ports. It appears to be an internal division of Taito that was responsible for producing home versions of games. While I don't know anything about how the Famicom Taito Chase H.Q. was created, it's almost a case study in how not to make a console version of an arcade game. Whereas, ideally, a Famicom version of an arcade game would add more sort of console-y elements to lengthen or deepen the game in order to make up for the fact that a lot is going to be lost in terms of visual excitement. Here, Taito simply released a badly crippled version of the original. Now, the premise is simple. You are some sort of Miami Vice-y type cop whose speciality is high-speed freeway chases. In fact, your unit's name is the Chase Special Investigation Department. Your mission is to chase down a series of fleeing criminals, starting with Ralph the Idaho Slasher, and get them to surrender by repeatedly ramming their car until it bursts into flames and then the bad guys have to abandon ship. You then get a little scene of you apprehending the criminal scum. The arcade game, which was simply titled Chase HQ, sort of resembled an action-packed version of Outrun. In glorious, sprite-based 3D you drive through cities, deserts, forests, tunnels, and so on. The arcade cabinet was a sit-down style cab, with a gear shift controller and so on. It was massively popular and got ported to every possible platform, including the Genesis and PC Engine, which of course we'll have to cover later. It was even released on the Game Boy. Ocean's ZX Spectrum port, despite being slow-moving and ugly, apparently was voted the best Spectrum game ever in a 1993 magazine poll, though I've at this point pretty much given up trying to understand the mindset of Spectrum aficionados. Well, the problem here is that Chase HQ was, all about spectacular visuals and fast-paced excitement, and that really can't be translated to the Famicom game, which looks like an uglier-than-average racing game. The music is severely downgraded, and most of the speech samples have been removed. They did add a few twists, such as between rounds being able to purchase vehicle upgrades, which supposedly enhance the performance. I was hoping oil would allow you to produce a Spy Hunter-style oil slick, but no such luck. Also, the original game has you going off-road at certain points. Taito Chase HQ doesn't even try to replicate that visually, but it still throws in tumbleweeds growing in the middle of the freeway, which is pretty damn stupid looking. One other new thing in the home version were these forks in the road. Taking the correct turn will either dramatically lengthen or shorten the route to the target car. A couple levels in the arcade game did have diverging paths like this, but they didn't really seem to impact the game that much as far as I can recall, whereas here, taking the wrong path makes it virtually impossible to reach the target car on time. Famitsu gave this a 24 out of 40, which sounds about right to me. Really, this is one of the more disappointing arcade ports on the Famicom, at least by 1989 standards. Wow, here's an unusual one. Super Mogura Tataki, Pokkun Mogura, from IGS, developed by Lord knows who. It's not every day we get to see a new publisher for the Famicom. IGS, whose logo tells us is short for Information Global Service, is a company that no one really seems to know or care anything about. They released a few games in the US, Rocketeer for the Super Nintendo, Violent Soldier for the TurboGrafx 16. They must have had some kind of connection to Taito. For example, the NES game Puzznic was published by Taito in the US instead of IGS as it was in Japan. They were putting out games until around 1993, and they are one of the very few Japanese game publishers for Nintendo consoles that don't have a Japanese Wikipedia page dedicated to them. So, Super Mogura Tataki is a whack-a-mole game. It came with this little pad that plugged into the expansion port of the Famicom, and a small hammer. Now, while the concept is obviously inspired by the Power Pad, this thing is much smaller. It's only a few inches longer and wider than the US Nintendo Entertainment System, so don't go thinking this is comparable in size to an actual mechanical whack-a-mole game. And this is the game. You use the hammer to hit the little creatures that pop up. Different colors are worth different amounts of points, There's a 60-second timer, and once it reaches 0, the round is over. If you hit 80% or more of the target, you go on to the next stage. Otherwise, you have to repeat the level until you reach the target. There's a bonus stage, but it's just a few extra seconds of hitting enemies. There are 6 stages altogether. They don't all use the entire 16 spaces on the mat, but often just the rightmost 12 spaces or the bottommost 12. While there's really not much to this game, I really can't hate it. Just like today, game companies need to produce games for the younger demographic, and I can see little kids getting a kick out of this. Obviously, for those watching this video, its appeal is going to be limited, but it probably would have been, pretty fun for a while when you were a little kid.
Superstar Pro Wrestling!
The last game of the second week of December, and it's a wrestling game from Pony Canyon. Yay! This is Superstar Pro Wrestling. Is he smoking a cigar? We have a roster here of real-life famous wrestlers, 12 altogether, including a few Western wrestlers like Andre the Giant and the Road Warriors. We also have this odd fellow who is playable just like all the rest of them. There are of course both one-player and two-player options. The default one-player mode is sort of a championship mode. You need to defeat each wrestler in consecutive bouts. Now each playable wrestler has a number of signature moves that you can pull off, and we choose 4 per match. You map these onto the D-pad in this menu page here. The actual gameplay is similar to most other wrestling games. In the ring you can either punch or kick your opponent. Doing so several times in a row will cause them to drop to one knee. You then press the A button and use the D-pad to select one of your special moves. A meter will appear at this point, with the bars going up and down crazily fast. Releasing the button will execute the move, and the number of bars on the meter at that point will determine the strength of the attack. You can then further attack your opponent while he's on the ground, either pinning him or picking him up and attacking again. Some other fun options here: you can throw him out of the ring, and at some point a wrench will appear, which can then be used to clock him on the head. And there's a variety of standard attacks as well, such as running your opponent into a clothesline, throwing him against the ropes, and if he's on the ground near a corner, you can climb on the turnbuckle and then jump on him. So, as you might know, a localized version of this was released by FCI in the United States under the name WCW Wrestling in April 1990. Though some people also call the game WCW World Championship Wrestling, or maybe the name is just World Championship Wrestling, I'm not sure. You may have noticed that games are often getting Western releases more and more quickly at this point, often just a few months after the Japanese release. This is of course a fully licensed game, which features the likenesses and names of 12 popular WCW stars, such as Ric Flair, Sting, Lex Luger, and a few others. Now, WCW began life as a wrestling promotion owned by Jim Crockett Jr., a promoter from North Carolina who bought out a number of other regional wrestling promotions in the 1980s in an attempt to compete with the WWF. In 1988, the media mogul Ted Turner bought out Crockett, and the thing was officially named World Championship Wrestling. Now, WCW was actually not really that successful when this game came out, but by the mid-90s, it was actually beating out the WWF in the television ratings. Of course, it eventually all came crashing down very quickly, and in 2000, the company was absorbed into the WWF. In the 90s, however, there was like a brief golden age for the WCW, and a number of games were released for the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation and such. This game certainly has its fans, and as someone who personally doesn't have any particular interest in wrestling or wrestling games, it's kind of hard for me to judge this. It was developed by Nichibutsu, who is not exactly the slickest developer out there. It isn't a particularly attractive looking game. There are a few things I don't like about the style of gameplay. For example, you can use punches and kicks in the ring, but I'm not sure what the point of the punch is because it has a shorter reach than the kick. so you'll always get hit with a kick before you can get in punching range. The game tends to fall into a pattern of both opponents kicking until one wrestler drops to his knees, then a special move can be used on him. There's no visible power meter, so I don't know when you can tell when the appropriate time to try to pin an opponent is. During one match, I immediately got put into a hold, and my wrestler actually then gave up. The entire match lasted maybe 20 seconds. The manual says you can break out of a hold, but I couldn't seem to get it to work in this case. So with its wide variety of options, wrestlers, special moves, and so on, WCW Wrestling certainly looks like an appealing game on paper. I saw that some folks online have called it the best NES wrestling game. It didn't really appeal much to me, but by all means, decide for yourself. Ew. We enter the third round of December releases with Abadox, a biological-themed shooter from Natsumi. So your little dude flies into the gigantic mouth of this living planet. The US manual calls the planet Parasitus and claims that it swallowed up an orbiting hospital ship which had a princess on board. Yeah, so somehow a rescue the princess plot got shoehorned into this thing. So Abadox is very clearly Gradius-like. Well, actually more than Gradius, it resembles Salamander, aka Life Force, with the whole biological theme. It begins almost exactly like every other Gradius clone. You shoot a few rows of enemies and then get a speed boost power-up. You can also find missiles and a barrier shield that works sort of like the options from Gradius. The first boss here is some sort of skeletal dog, so Abadox is definitely not original at all. However, what it lacks in originality, it makes up for in general awesomeness. It takes elements from other games and mixes them into a surprisingly enjoyable mishmash. It's actually a bit more consistent than Salamander when it comes to keeping with the whole biological thing. It mixes in downward vertical levels with the standard horizontal levels. This right here is apparently the throat, and you more or less travel through the planet's digestive system. Look at all these disgusting organic walls which kind of pulse. The art design is so good in this game, and the boss here is some kind of orifice. Abadox is relatively difficult. Like so many of these other games, there's sort of like a rule that you should not die in the wrong place. Getting killed strips you of all your power-ups, which suddenly makes the game much tougher. Luckily, the barriers and protective shields give you the ability to take a few hits before dying. There's lots of great environmental hazards here as well, like these giant teeth that get in your way. Almost all the bosses are quite weird and creepy, like look at this guy. Now there is one rather strange spaceship sort of looking level in which the boss is a large robot, but for the most part Abadox keeps pretty close to the balance of organic and mechanical elements. And this might be disappointing to some, but the final boss is one of those that you can easily defeat in like 2 seconds if you know how. Basically, you just go right up to the left eye and then blast away. So that's the princess? What happened to her clothes? This is the Japanese version, by the way. For the US release, they gave her sort of like a purple leotard thing. And the ending is, of course, one of those super fast escape from the base levels, before it explodes. Pretty much designed to eat up any extra lives you might have left. It's actually a real dick move to end the game with this, in my opinion, since you get pretty much all the way through it and then die and not be able to see the ending. Now, we've seen way more crappy shooters on the Famicom than we have good ones. That's undeniable. Abadox definitely falls into the good category. As I mentioned, it lacks any kind of originality whatsoever, but it makes up for this by being pretty damn rad looking, having really great music, and just being fun to play. Let me tell you, the things that I have to tolerate during the course of this series. Here is yet another licensed property game. The full name of this is quite long, so we'll just refer to it simply as Katte ni Shiro Kuma. Published by CBS, who mostly did licensed junk at this point, and developed by Graphic Research. That's the same guys who did Meimon Takonishi Ouendan, the first game this episode. We haven't seen tons of Graphic Research titles, so it's kind of surprising to end up with 2 in one episode. So you start off this game by talking to God, or at least some sort of nature deity. Katte ni Shiro Kuma is, once again, a menu-based adventure game, but with some vaguely RPG elements thrown in. For example, you might notice you have hit points as well as IQ points. Later in the game, much later, you will encounter enemies and RPG-style battles, but the entire first chunk of the game mostly involves you walking around in a Dragon Quest-y type overworld, interacting with the environment and other animals. Now this is sort of an unusual idea for a video game, so imagine my surprise when it turned out that Katte ni Shiro Kuma is also a manga from the pen of one Koji Aihara. It ran in Weekly Shonen Jump from 1983 to 1986. It's a nature comic based on the lives of a group of slightly anthropomorphized animals living in the wilderness. Now, I was shocked, I say, to learn there was also an anime which came out in 1987. Neither the game nor the anime seem to be particularly well remembered today. I didn't find many gameplay videos on YouTube, though naturally one fellow did a series of videos on the game on Nico Nico. Shiro, the main character, looks like he's probably a polar bear, but is in fact supposed to be an albino Japanese brown bear. He's friends with a few other bears and a boar. You have your standard menu commands here. The game starts off in a pretty prosaic fashion. You talk to nearby animals, explore the area, eventually you encounter some mysterious tracks. At various points, a conversation will occur, which will result in you gaining some hit points or IQ points. Eventually you'll be able to switch characters and eventually get the other 2 characters to join your party. One annoying thing is that unlike the single tile-sized characters in most RPGs, Shiro is more than 1 tile long, and it can be annoying to try to get him lined up correctly when trying to enter a cave entrance or cross over a bridge. Apparently this gets much worse later in the game when you have 2 other characters tagging along behind him. Realistically, Katte ni Shiro Kuma is a game you will probably not want to play for more than about 2 minutes. It's unlikely to get a translation anytime soon, and it probably rightly deserves its place on the scrap heap of forgotten Famicom games. Somehow we lucked out last episode and didn't have a single baseball game, at least as far as I can recall. No such luck today though. Gekitou Stadium from Tecmo. Boy, a baseball game from Tecmo sounds promising, right? I mean, Tecmo Bowl is good, right? Well, I hate to disappoint you, but Gekitou Stadium is at its core a straight-up clone of Namco's Family Stadium series. The first game, of course, you'll remember being released in the US as RBI Baseball. I mean, look at it, even has the word stadium right there in the title. You choose teams based on real-life baseball teams, though of course no actual team names or logos are displayed. While the game itself is virtually identical to many of the baseball games we've seen before, there are a few nice touches that makes it stand out a little bit. For example, those nice little animations that sometimes appear when a certain action occurs. For example, when throwing the ball to a baseman and the runner tries to slide, you might get this animation. So there are some other interesting features, like the umpires are all rabbits, for a completely undisclosed reason. Every time a runner gets called out, he doesn't just turn around and head back to the dugout, he actually falls to the ground as if unconscious. My theory is that Gekitou Stadium takes place in some dystopian future world where athletes are forced to wear like shock collars that zap them into unconsciousness when they fail. That's just my theory. Tecmo released most of their sports games in the US as well, so Gekitou Stadium came out here as Bad News Baseball in 1990. The American title makes a pretty untimely reference to the Bad News Bears movies, the last of which, Bad News Bears Go to Japan, came out 12 years earlier. For the US version, very little was changed, aside from translating the text. The two versions are pretty much completely identical. It's a reasonably slick, though rather generic baseball game, which is perhaps a bit disappointing coming off of Dusty Diamond's All-Star Softball from 2 episodes ago. The two-player game is fine, but playing against the AI is brutal, even by NES baseball game standards. The computer's team will catch just about every single hit you get, and when he's at the bat he almost never gets a strike, and gets home runs on a pretty frequent basis. On the other hand, I very rarely got a foul ball when I was batting, so at least there's one improvement over most other baseball games. One last feature I'll mention is the hidden option to switch to a girls' team instead of the boys' team. This is done by holding down buttons on the controllers while turning on the console. This option is purely superficial, it just changes the names and the sprites, but it is a nice touch. So that pretty much sums up Gekitou Stadium. A bog standard baseball game made slightly better by adding in a few nice touches. Alright, here we have Shinsenden, an RPG from Irem and developed by Tamtex. Tamtex was actually an internal development division within Irem, so unlike some of the more shadowy development companies, their name and logo is featured prominently when you start up the game. And this is actually Irem's first RPG for the Famicom. They've released a few adventure games, a strategy game, puzzle games, one excellent compile developed shoot 'em up, a number of sports games, and last episode they had one of those mini Yonku car games, but somehow they've completely avoided RPGs until now. We're fortunate to have an unofficial fan translation here so we can appreciate the details of the story. It begins in media res, with this dude escaping from some bad guys. Then cuts away and introduces our hero. This is the kind of dramatic opening sequence that first appeared in Famicom RPGs in Dragon Quest II, and has since become kind of a standard thing. And this is very, very much in the standard Famicom RPG style. You play a young hero who gets sent on a mission, which eventually turns into a grand heroic quest to save the world or something. You begin with one companion, a female monk, which are normally called nuns, by the way, named Raichi. And wow, she's a bit on the young side. Can you even really consent to becoming a monk at that age? Now it's worth noting just how formulaic JRPGs have become at this point. And really it's been around 2 years' time since Dragon Quest II. So certain JRPG cliches, such as finding useful items hiding in jars in the village, are found here. We also have the inn in the first village, which will heal you for free. In the next village we have a guy who can resurrect dead party members and save your game, and of course we have the item shop and the weapon shop. Your first order of business, and the game actually specifically tells you to do this, is to get some decent armor and weapons at the nearby village. Of course you'll need money, so we start by wandering around the first village for an hour or so fighting monsters and healing. Everything in the battle system is completely intuitive to anyone who's played any of these things before. You take turns attacking, Raichi quickly gets a fire spell and a healing spell once she gains a couple levels, which is very helpful. Your main character is focused more on physical attacks. Occasionally you can evade an attack, and sometimes score a quote-unquote direct attack, which is like a critical strike or something and does extra damage. You select a group of enemies to attack, and if both characters attack the same group, and your first character successfully kills that enemy, your second character will not retarget another enemy, but rather instead just do nothing, just like Final Fantasy I. This is something that people complained a lot about in these early RPGs, but, was pretty standard at the time. So once you've built up enough levels and gold to buy decent equipment, you can head on out to your first real quest, a nearby cave. I'll point out that Shinsenden can be brutally difficult. Random enemy encounters are very frequent, and there were many cases where after defeating a group of enemies, I took literally one step forward and got another random encounter. If you're playing this on an emulator, you'll want to use save states constantly. Your first boss encounter will net you a better sword, and it's not so much that the bosses or enemies are really that tough exactly, it's just that there are so many fights, and it's easy to use up all your magic and healing items in the middle of the dungeon. Shinsenden, like Dragon Quest II or Final Fantasy II, does have a plot of sorts, and quite a few scripted events that propel the action forward. You encounter the dude from the prologue in the dungeon, which sort of opens up the main plot regarding various powerful mystic swords or something. One rather pleasing aspect of this game, which is something I don't think I've really seen much before in these RPGs, is that various cutscenes will actually move you from one part of the map to the other. So for example, when you get to the end of the first dungeon, the game sort of flashes forward to the first village, so you don't actually have to trek all the way back through the dungeon, thus avoiding a very irritating part of old RPGs when you defeat the boss, but are then low on health and get killed before you reach a save point. Also, party members will come and go. Raichi gets kidnapped and some other guy joins your party, and this continues throughout the game. This is something we've seen in a few games previously, such as Final Fantasy II. So Shinsenden is not going to set anyone's world on fire, but it is a pretty nice example of an RPG from the middle of the Famicom era. Alright, here we are, the big game this episode, Sweet Home from Capcom. Not a game that I particularly cared for, but nonetheless a big, ambitious game from a titanic figure in gaming, Tokuro Fujiwara. So to start off, you have 5 characters you must name. Naturally, they also have default names taken from the Sweet Home movie. And yes, if you didn't know, this is sort of a movie adaptation. So, while Sweet Home was only released in Japan, we do have a recent English translation from 2017 by the Siege and JMN to replace the old translation from like 15 years ago. It's supposedly a bit more accurate. Sweet Home begins with a 5-man film crew entering the Mamiya Mansion, the former residence of the now-deceased painter Ichiro Mamiya. Trouble begins when an earthquake or some other mysterious phenomenon hits the mansion, blocking the exit. So I suppose the goal of the game is simply to get out of the house. You'd think that you could just walk out the back door. I mean, there must be a servant's entrance or something in a mansion this size, but no, the place is crawling with monsters and ghosts, and many of the doors are locked. One unusual mechanic here: you need to split your 5-member group into teams. For some reason, the most members you can put into a group is 3, so you'll need to usually have a 1 3-member group and 1 2-member group, which are controlled separately. You use the menu to switch back and forth between the 2 groups. This is both the most unique thing about Sweet Home, and the most annoying thing about it. Sweet Home is more or less an RPG, though one that dispenses with most of the normal RPG conventions, as we shall see later. So this is certainly an original and fascinating game, but it's mostly remembered today as being sort of the prototype for Resident Evil. Tokuro Fujiwara's original intention for Resident Evil was to make sort of an updated 3D version of Sweet Home, and a number of folks call Sweet Home the first quote-unquote survival horror game, and in fact it does have certain similarities to Resident Evil and Silent Hill and those kinds of games. One of these is the extremely limited inventory space. Each character can hold one weapon and 2 items. They also have an additional inventory slot, which is occupied by a special item that is unique to each character and which cannot be unequipped. For example, Asuka's special item is the vacuum cleaner, because she's a woman, which is used to clean broken glass out of the way and also to clean the dust off the murals so that they can be photographed, which by the way is done using Taguchi's camera. The other 3 items are Akiku's remedy, which is used for curing status ailments, Kazuro's lighter, which is rather oddly used to burn pieces of rope, which sometimes block your way, and finally Emi's key, which is used to unlock doors. So 3 out of the 5 items are mostly used to get past obstacles in the game. Now the upshot of the limited inventory space is that you will almost always have to drop an item when you find a new one. Among the items you can find are some extremely valuable potions, and there's a very limited number of these in the game, and those are the only way that you can replenish your health. There's also various quest items required to move the game forward, and there's also items such as boards, ropes, and so on, which are needed to get past obstacles. Of course, you never know what you're going to encounter as you make your way through the mansion, so it's never obvious what items you should have with you at any time, thus often requiring some backtracking, though some items are very conveniently placed right before the place that you're actually going to need to use them. So the other interesting thing about Sweet Home is that it's the second and final Capcom game that must have come out of some sort of partnership with Toho and the director Juzo Itami. The first, of course, being the Taxing Woman game from September. Now, Sweet Home, the movie, hit theaters in January 1989, and was released on VHS and Laserdisc later that year. Fujiwara said he was allowed to visit the set while Sweet Home was being filmed in order to get ideas for the game. However, while Itami produced Sweet Home the movie, he didn't actually direct it, giving the job to a young director named Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who would of course later find fame for his horror movies, such as The Cure and Pulse, before obtaining a certain amount of respectability in the 2000s for his more dramatic work such as Tokyo Sonata. So let's talk a bit about Sweet Home the movie and how it relates to the game. The plot of the film involves a TV news crew visiting this abandoned mansion in order to investigate stories of the artist's final piece of work, a fresco painted on a wall inside the mansion. The crew includes Kazuo, who apparently is managing the production, his potential love interest, Akiko, played by Tommy's wife Nobuko Miyamoto, who is also the titular taxing woman. There's also Kazuo's daughter Emi, who wants her widower father to hook up with Akiko. And then we have the sultry, somewhat diva-ish TV anchor Asuka, and the imbecilic and horny camera operator Taguchi. The crew quickly finds the mural, but strange things start happening, apparently due to Taguchi knocking over a pile of rocks, which served as kind of a ward against evil spirits. All kinds of bizarre things start occurring. Additional creepy paintings appear on the other walls surrounding the original fresco. Asuka becomes somewhat possessed and digs up the coffin of a disfigured baby and brings it into the house. The main monster, if you will, in the movie is simply a mysterious shadow that appears and sets people on fire. First burning off Taguchi's entire lower half, and then melting Asuka. The local gas station attendant is played by Itami in an absurd fake beard, and he tells that Mamiya's wife went insane when their young child crawled inside a furnace and burned to death, and then she went on a kidnapping spree, murdering children from the area by tossing them into the furnace, so her own child would have playmates in heaven or something. The second half of the movie mostly involves Akiko, Kazuo, and Tommy's character trying to rescue Emi from the ghost of Mamiya's wife. The finale involves a confrontation with the ghost, who is actually a pretty well done animatronic puppet in this case. Now, Sweet Home is not a good movie by anyone's standards. It's a bit too long, the characters are broad cliches, the house is not very well designed. I mean, you really get no idea of the layout of the place, and despite being sort of like an almost castle-like multi-level structure, all we ever see are just a series of generic-looking hallways and mostly indistinguishable rooms. The only two areas that have any character are the mural room and the basement, and whatever room has this Art Nouveau piece of decor, which we see multiple times. The movie looks and feels pretty cheap, almost like a TV movie, aside from the special effects sequences, which are pretty impressive. The lighting is done in what I call a 1980s music video style, meaning there's all these unknown light sources casting ornate shadows all over everything, almost as if every room in the castle has like giant skylight windows, which based on the views that we get of it from the outside simply does not appear to be the case. Now, to further confuse matters, the version available on tape and Laserdisc is not the same as what played in theaters, as Itami was supposedly not satisfied with Kurosawa's results and refilmed a number of sequences and changed the ending. It would probably not be remembered at all today, except as a curio in the filmography of Kurosawa and Itami, were it not for the game's connection to Resident Evil. And it's never even been released after the Laserdisc came out in 1989, so you just can't go to Netflix or Amazon if you want to see a copy. Now for the game, it takes the basic premise, 5 people in a house haunted by the ghost of lady whose kid died, but other than that, it's pretty much entirely different from the movie's plot. The movie kills off 2 of the 5 characters pretty quickly, which the game doesn't do unless they accidentally get killed in combat. The object of Sweet Home the game is mostly just to get out of the house, by making your way through this sort of huge, sprawling complex. In the movie, the characters don't really get trapped in the house, and could in theory have left at any time, though there is a subplot about their jeep breaking down, which somewhat delays their leaving. And while the frescoes seem to indicate that something weird and creepy had happened, they are pretty much forgotten after the first 20 minutes or so. While in the game you keep finding frescoes throughout the mansion that give you various clues, so the frescoes play a bigger part in the game than they do in the movie. The first major sub-goal you have in Sweet Home is to locate the generator, so that you can restore power to the mansion, thus turning the lights back on. You do eventually find it housed in a rather video gamey looking metal building, but you also need to locate the gasoline. And in the movie there's also a generator that needs to be turned on, but this happens at the very beginning and is a pretty uneventful scene. Likewise, a light fixture falls in the movie at one point, which in the game gets turned into a recurring sort of quick-time event in which you have to quickly press a button in order to avoid some object hitting you. Some of the characters' special items have analogs in the film. Taguchi does operate a camera to film the proceedings, and a vacuum cleaner is used to uncover the fresco in one scene, but it's not used by Asuka. Akiko does bandage Kazuo's hand at one point, which might correspond to her being the healing character in the game, and there is a key which fails to open the door, but it has no connection to Emmy, and a lighter, as far as I can recall, doesn't come into play in the film at all. One of the game's primary appealing factors is the enemies, most of which are excellently drawn and quite creepy and gruesome. None of them make any appearance in the film, where the evil spirit, perhaps for budgetary reasons, takes the form of an actual shadow just crawling across the walls. But in the game you definitely get a Resident Evil vibe from some of the monsters, such as the zombie dogs that roam around near the generator. The game gives you hints about the evil doings in the house in the form of notes, diary entries, skeletons, talking dolls, and oddly what appear to be bloodied but still living people just sort of lying around in the hallways. In the movie, Itami's character simply explains the whole deal about the dead wife, but here you don't get the whole story until the very end. A slide projector plays an important part in the game at the very end, but it also appears in the movie near the very beginning and is of very little consequence. So again, there's a lot of elements for the movie that kind of get rejiggered into the game in very different ways. Almost all the various hazards found in the house, such as sticky floors, bats, weird purple slime, rubble that needs to be smashed with a mallet, suits of armor that attack you, giant holes in the floor that you crossed using a wooden board, pretty much none of these appear in the film at all. So in the end, Capcom's Sweet Home is virtually a new creation, totally separate from the film. As I mentioned earlier, it's generally considered to be an RPG. You do have hit points, or life as it's called here. There are levels, and you level up after getting enough experience, but there aren't any visible experience points, except when you've won a battle that shows you how many points you obtained. So you can't really tell how close you are to leveling up just by looking at your character stats. You do have a visible attack stat, and then you have something called Prey, which is a rather odd sort of magic that has several uses. In terms of equipment, you can equip a weapon, but no armor or accessories. There are no sorts of elemental affinities or anything, though silver weapons work better against ghosts and such. Oddly, most of the items can be used in battle to do damage to certain enemies, but it's not always clear which enemies they're useful for, so you can experiment with various items, and learn, for example, that the lighter can be used on, say, the maggots to do damage, but on most other enemies it has no effect at all. There are no shops or inns or even any real NPCs other than the gas station attendant who appears a bit later in the game, so it's an RPG that's kind of pared down to the absolute essentials. I mean, the game is mostly about exploring the house, collecting items, and finding random battles. I suppose you could call it an RPG that takes place entirely inside a very large dungeon. The emphasis on environmental hazards and basic puzzle solving make it feel sort of like it's half RPG and half adventure game. Now, the most striking way in which this deviates from the standard RPG formula is that characters cannot be revived ever once they die, and the death scene is brutally gruesome. Now, in order to make the game beatable after a character dies, there is a replacement item somewhere in the house for every special item. So for example, if Emmy dies, you'll need to find the wire which opens doors just like Emmy's key. And for example, the pills do the same thing as Akiko's remedy. Cures you of the enemy-inflicted statuses such as poison. Overall, Sweet Home is pretty tough and unforgiving. While it's a quality-made game, I can't say I actually liked playing it. It's the most stripped-down RPG possible. It's really just walking into a series of rooms and fighting monsters. It almost boils down to being an inventory management game, as you're always needing to drop items to pick up new items, or go back later and then find items that you weren't able to carry earlier. The system of having two separate parties means that you constantly have to switch back and forth between the two, so they don't get too far separated. Though there is a call function, which is where when one team goes into battle, you can switch to the other team and then join the battle. This is highly recommended because this will give all the members in the battle experience points. But overall, I just felt like too much time was spent fiddling around in menus, more so than in most RPGs. And there's really no characterization other than, I suppose, at the very beginning when there's a few lines of dialogue. And every place in the mansion has this sort of samey feel to it, other than a few places, such as there's a period where you go outside and explore around a lake. Other than that, it's mostly just a series of halls and rooms. But by all means, take advantage of the new fan translation and try Sweet Home for yourself. A lot of people love this game to absolute pieces, and if you are a Resident Evil fan, you owe it to yourself to check out that game's ancestor. Geez, how many episodes has it been since we've seen a Konami game? Last one was perhaps Twinbee 3? Unfortunately, the game we have here today is a piece of hot garbage. I speak, of course, of Top Gun: Dual Fighters. Well, the intro is cool at least. And the music in Top Gun: Dual Fighters is frickin' on point. Konami had an enormously talented musical staff at this time, and I'd say the music is probably the main thing this game has going for it. Naturally, this was released in the US under the name Top Gun: The Second Mission. Not much, if anything, was changed. So on a purely technical level, this is a pretty big improvement over the first game. Check out this intro sequence where your jet takes off. Konami has made a lot of superficial improvements when compared to the first Top Gun game, but I still do not actually like this. Now here's the regular mission mode. There's also a versus mode where you can face off against computer opponents, or in the two-player mode against another player. There are 3 missions in the mission mode. Each has you engaging a number of enemy jets and some submarines for some reason. At the end of each mission, you then face down a boss. Controls are pretty simple. One button accelerates and the other one fires your weapon. Pressing the B button once or holding it down fires your machine gun, and then tapping B twice fires a guided missile. In theory, the missiles will lock on to an enemy in the reticule, but they don't always successfully hit their target. One nice bit in this game is that you must select what type of missile you want. The better the missiles are, the fewer you get. I guess even the Air Force has a budget when it comes to missiles. I went with the medium missiles, which I suppose is a balance between power and quantity. Now, Top Gun 2 is, I guess, better than Top Gun 1. There's more variety, and most importantly, the landing your jet minigame is not the horrible mess that it was in the first game. Just poking around online, a number of folks seem to really like this game, and some game magazine reviews really praised it. One rather weird exception was the British magazine Mean Machines, which considered it to be inferior to the first Top Gun game in just about every respect, which is a really weird opinion to have. I think my issue is I just don't like these type of aircraft combat games. I mean, I think Afterburner is fun, but I just absolutely hated Top Gun Dual Fighters for almost every second I was playing it. The first boss was okay perhaps. So here's the revised landing sequence. Basically, you just position your sighting reticule in the middle of the aircraft carrier, and then you're good to go. So much better times are ahead for Konami next episode, so I would definitely anticipate a really great Konami game that we'll be looking at that time. The penultimate game this episode, Pinball Quest, and boy, this is a weird one. Obviously it's a pinball game, published by Jalico and developed by Tosei. Now let's get the normal part of the game out of the way first. There are 3 tables you can play, Pop Pop, Viva Golf, and Circus. Any of these can be played for up to 4 players. They are pretty standard pinball video game tables, each has its own theme. Pop Pop is sort of like a 50s USA Happy Days style cultural thing going on. There are bowling pins, a girl jumping over a jukebox, and an American flag. You can even get your ball into that little pool table area on the left side there. Viva Golf is, well, golf themed, and the table resembles a golf course. And finally we have Circus, which aside from the circus theme also has a slot machine. Maybe it's supposed to be more like a Las Vegas circus kind of deal, rather than an actual circus in a tent. Now all of this is well and good for a pinball game, but the real meat and potatoes comes in the form of the RPG option. Yes, that's right, a pinball RPG. So let me get this out there right off the bat. I hate this game. I have more unadulterated hatred for Pinball Quest than any other game this episode, which is a shame because it's kind of a clever idea. Now this is not really an RPG, but it sort of employs some RPG elements, I guess. Now, the Japanese version came in like a rather non-standard looking Famicom box, as Jalico sometimes did do, and the cartridge was kind of oddly shaped, though I'm not really sure why. This did get a US release in summer 1990, in which the cartoon box art was replaced by sort of slightly more metal artwork featuring the Grim Reaper inside a pinball. And rather than using the term RPG, the US box calls Pinball Quest a quote-unquote multi-screen fantasy in pinball format, which is probably technically more accurate than RPG. Each level is basically a two-screen table, with an enemy at the top. Often there are smaller enemies hanging around on the upper screen as well. They just sort of get in your way. It generally requires that you first get the ball into the upper half of the table, and then you need to hit the boss enemy with the ball a bunch of times until you kill him. On the very first level, the boss drops a key which is used to open the castle door. Once inside the castle, you'll face a series of similar bosses, but there's also actually a shop in between tables where you can buy improved flippers and stoppers. Now there are stoppers that will disappear after being hit by a ball only once, as well as stoppers that can take multiple hits. There's flippers that cause the ball to do more damage to enemies. Additionally, rather than buying, you can also select steal, which has a chance of you walking out of the shop with some random items, but what usually happens is you simply get beat up by the shopkeeper and lose half your money. I was never able to successfully steal even once when playing this game. As I mentioned, I really hated Pinball Quest. Now, I'm not really into pinball video games. I understand the appeal of pinball tables, but a lot of that appeal to me lies in the actual physicality of the table. You know, the various bumpers, seeing the ball whiz around. A 2D simulation of a pinball table played on the Nintendo Entertainment System doesn't really sound that exciting to me. Regardless, I found Pinball Quest to be an unusually frustrating game because it has very concrete goals, and you can make temporary progress towards those goals, but there is really no permanent progress in this game. For example, in a regular RPG, once you earn experience points or level up or learn new skills, that's a form of permanent progress. You don't lose experience points or de-level if you make mistakes. In Pinball Quest, if your ball drops into the drain, you will automatically exit that table, and the door to the table will then be locked. You then need to go back one stage and replay the prior table. Beating that table will then let you back up into the table that originally booted you out earlier. And remember, just losing one ball will cause you to get kicked off the table. So to beat the game, you essentially have to play through every level consecutively without making a single mistake. And it's actually pretty easy to lose the ball just based on the way the tables are designed. So playing this has a real one step forward, two steps backward feel to it. It's quite easy to get like halfway through it, make a few mistakes, end up right back at the very beginning of the game. You have an infinite number of lives, so it seems like you could spend virtually an eternity bouncing around between the various game levels. Now, of course, I understand that losing balls is easy in this game, so that the game will take longer to beat. And in theory, I think the way to approach this might be to keep playing sort of like the same tables over and over again until you can start to afford the expensive upgrades, which will then lessen the chance of losing a ball. But for me personally, the game's pattern of making progress and then losing sometimes all that progress and having to play through the same tables that you just beat a minute ago became incredibly infuriating after a while. I mean, if you really enjoy pinball video games, maybe you'll actually like this, but I grew to absolutely hate Pinball Quest very quickly. All good things must come to an end, and that includes this episode. Our last game today is Flipull. It is the 90s, and there is time for Flipull, the exciting cube game, as opposed to all those other boring cube games. There's two modes, normal and advance. Normal is the more spontaneous play mode, and advance is a bit more like a strategy mode, I guess. You move that little guy up and down on the ladder to choose where you want to throw your block. You can throw it either at the blocks along the right side of the block pile, or along the top side. You need to throw your block at a matching block. Doing so will eliminate any matching blocks until it hits the first non-matching block, which will then be replaced by the block you just threw. If you get a situation where you end up getting back a block that can't be thrown because there's no matching blocks, then you will get a quote-unquote miss. Then the worthless block you were stuck with will be replaced by a wild card type block, which will automatically transform into a match for whatever block you throw it at. But you only get 3 of these per level, so it's important to almost always be thinking a little ahead so you don't end up with a block that can't be used. You can die if you run out of time or use all 3 of your special blocks and then get stuck with a miss. Flipull began life as a Taito arcade game released in the US under the name Plotting, which makes exactly as much sense as the name Flipull. The arcade version wasn't exactly a technological marvel, so it wasn't too much of a challenge to fit this thing on the Famicom. However, the same can't really be said about the Game Boy version from 1990, which even got a US release under the original name Flipull. One of the gnarliest brain games around, as the box said. The lack of color and low resolution meant the blocks had to be redesigned, so for example the Taito logo was lost. And the blocks aren't quite as distinguishable as they were in the color versions. This was also released on various computer platforms, but all of these went under the name Plotting. So as far as I know, the Game Boy version was the only Western release to use the original name of Flipull. As you proceed, later stages will have larger piles of blocks and different icons on the blocks. So, for the advanced mode, here's where it gets a bit trickier. There is no timer here, but the blocks are arranged in a way so that you really have to use them in a very specific order, otherwise you'll get stuck in an unwinnable situation. You have no wildcard blocks, so making even one mistake is an instant life lost. So rather than firing off blocks in an improvised fashion, you need to sort of take a minute to plot out your plan of attack. Flipull is a surprisingly pleasant game. Even though the mechanics are pretty unusual, it only takes a minute to pick up, and is actually pretty intuitive once you get the hang of it. So really, Flipull is one of the totally unoffensive games this episode. Alright, another 15 games down, and we are so close to being done with 1989. Just 2 more episodes and we'll be on to 1990. So the best game this episode? Well, I almost feel obligated to give it to Sweet Home. It is such an original game in so many ways that I almost feel bad I didn't like it. So maybe Sweet Home and Abadox can share the prize. Abadox being my personal favorite this time around. Worst game, I could say Pinball Quest, which is probably along with Top Gun, the game that I hated the most. Yet, Pinball Quest is at least a unique idea, and Top Gun is pretty well liked by folks who enjoy console air combat games, and they did improve on the landing minigame, so I guess I'll say Taito Chase HQ. There's just no point in porting this to an 8-bit system, it just doesn't work. It's a mere shadow of the arcade game. A 16-bit port would work better, I'm sure, but this one was pretty bad. Next time, well, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news, I hope you like baseball games first of all. Also, there's some terrible junk from the likes of Acclaim and a famously hated license title from LJN. And the good news, it's one of the absolute best action platformer type NES games from good old reliable Konami. Now I hope to get this new episode out in a reasonable time period. I've also got some bonus content coming up that I sort of had lying around for a while. And over on the Dr. Sparkle After Dark channel, we'll be covering the weird indie horror movie Pigs. So keep your eyes peeled, and I hope you all have a very happy Halloween.